She didn't cry, not even when the iron hissed against her skin. He pressed the glowing metal into her flesh like she was nothing more than cattle, an animal to be marked and owned. Her name was Ellie Mae Bridger. She was 24 years old, her arms were tied behind her back, and her face was pressed into the dry, unforgiving dirt of the Arizona territory. That brand, a cruel swirl of lines she couldn't see, would scar over. It would stay with her forever. And so would the memory of the men who stood and watched. But that wasn't the worst part, not by a long shot. The worst part came weeks later, in the suffocating silence that followed. The silence that screamed a terrible truth. Nobody was coming for her. Not her uncle, who had a face like a clenched fist and a soul soaked in whiskey. Not the neighbors who would surely have heard her pleas if they hadn't bolted their doors and pulled their curtains tight. Not even the preacher's wife, the one who'd once patted her head and called her a girl with rare promise. That was the moment Ellie learned a lesson colder than any winter night. Some people don't just disappear, they're erased. And when a person has been erased from the world, the only thing left is what they can claw back for themselves, with nothing but blood, bone, and a will to survive that burns hotter than any branding iron. It had all started just a few weeks earlier. Her uncle, a man who had long since traded his heart for the bottle, made another trade. This time, the price was her. He swapped his niece, his own flesh and blood, for a rusted-out rifle he probably couldn't shoot straight and a half-empty bottle of bourbon. There was no contract, no handshake, just a spit of tobacco juice into the dust and a hard shove that sent her stumbling toward the two waiting men. "You'll be fine," he'd muttered, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Fine. The word was a joke, a bitter, cruel joke in a world that had forgotten how to laugh. The men didn't speak to her. They didn't have to. Their silence was its own kind of violence. They walked her across the dry, cracked belly of Arizona, through dust storms that whipped and stung her skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The sun was relentless, a merciless eye in a bleached white sky, and with every step, a piece of the old Ellie Mae Bridger turned to dust and blew away on the hot wind. She wasn't a person anymore. She was cargo. When they finally reached their destination, a small, hidden camp nestled near a stream bed that had given up on finding water, they left her standing alone in the center of it all. The sun beat down. The silence of the camp was different from the silence of the journey. This was an observant silence, a waiting silence. She expected to be thrown in a cage, chained to a post. Worse, what she got was something far more unnerving. A tall man stepped out from one of the lodges. His skin was the color of weathered sandstone, and his long dark hair was tied back with pins carved from bone. He moved with a quiet grace that didn't belong in this rough, brutal world. He walked right up to her, his dark eyes taking in every detail. He saw the torn dress, the exhaustion in her bones, the fear she was trying so desperately to hide. But he wasn't looking at her like a man sizing up a prize. He was looking at her like a man reading a story, a long and terrible story written in pain. He didn't touch her, not yet. He just stood there, his presence a silent question mark in the suffocating heat. And Ellie, who had braced herself for the worst, found herself holding her breath, waiting for a verdict she couldn't begin to understand. What was this place? Who were these people? The man finally moved. He reached out, not to grab her, not to hurt her, but with a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted the sun-stained bonnet from her head. Her hair, tangled and matted with dust, fell around her shoulders. And there, on her neck, just below her ear, was the angry red brand, the mark of her shame, the symbol that said she belonged to someone else. She expected him to flinch, to sneer, to show some sign of disgust or triumph. He did none of those things. He just looked at the scar, his expression unreadable. Then, right there in the middle of the desert, under the unforgiving gaze of the sun and the silent watch of the camp, he did something that shattered Ellie's world. He began to braid her hair. His fingers were surprisingly gentle, working through the knots with a patience she hadn't known in years. He wasn't claiming her. He wasn't marking her as his own. He was tending to her as if she were not a broken thing to be used, but something sacred to be cared for. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ellie's breath didn't taste like dust and iron. It tasted like a fragile, terrifying thing she had almost forgotten. Hope. The next morning, she woke up expecting to be in chains. The gentle act of the previous day had to be a trick, a cruel psychological game before the real horror began. That's how her world worked. Kindness was just a mask that cruelty wore when it was feeling patient. But there were no chains. Instead, a young woman brought her a wooden bowl of warm water to wash her face, and another bowl filled with a sweet corn mush. It was the simplest meal imaginable, but as Ellie ate, she realized it was the first food she'd had in weeks that didn't taste of pity or contempt. It was just food. They had given her a small lodge to herself, a shelter made of hides and wood, and as she sat outside in the morning sun, a strange and unsettling feeling began to creep over her. No one was guarding her. No one whispered as she passed. The children in the camp played, their laughter occasionally piercing the quiet air. The women worked, grinding roots or mending clothes, their movements efficient and practiced. They glanced at her, yes, but their looks weren't filled with scorn or suspicion. It was just curiosity. The quiet was wrong. It was too soft to be real, too peaceful to be safe. She'd been a commodity for so long, passed from one pair of rough hands to another, that she had forgotten what silence without a threat felt like. Here, the silence wasn't a prelude to violence. It felt like space, room to breathe. Later that day, an elder woman approached her. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, each line telling a story of survival. Her name, Ellie would learn, was Mahuya. She didn't say much. She simply handed Ellie a piece of dyed cloth. It was a deep burnt orange, the color of desert clay at sunset. The texture was rough, handmade. Ellie took it, her fingers tracing the simple patterns. She didn't ask what it was for. She didn't need to. She folded it and pressed it against her chest. The simple weight of it, a strange comfort. It was a gift, and no one had given her a gift in years. That night, the camp gathered around a central fire. The flames danced, casting long, flickering shadows on the faces of the people. They weren't smiling at her, but they weren't glaring either. They were just watching, waiting. It felt like a trial, but one where she didn't know the charge or the crime. Then Tohan, the man who had braided her hair, spoke. He looked at Mahuya, then at Ellie, and said a single word in their native Paiute tongue. It was short, firm, and decisive. Mahuya looked at Ellie, her dark eyes holding no ceremony, no grand pronouncements. He says, accepted. Accepted. Just one word. No test she had to pass. No ritual she had to endure. No questions about where she came from or what horrors she had fled. Just accepted. The word hung in the air, heavier than stone, lighter than air. Ellie didn't know what to do with it. Part of her mind, the part that had been sharpened by years of betrayal, screamed that it was a lie. Another trick. But something else, a small, forgotten piece of her heart, began to unfurl like a fist slowly opening. She stayed seated by the fire long after the others had moved on. The normal sounds of the camp resumed. Someone began to play a low, haunting melody on a small wooden flute. A dog barked once, then seemed to give up halfway through, as if it was too much effort. Ellie pulled the orange cloth tighter around her shoulders. It didn't offer much warmth against the cool desert night, but it felt like a shield. Not a shield to hide her shame, but one that held it. It wrapped around the ugly brand on her skin and seemed to whisper, "This is part of your story, but it is not the end of it." That night, for the first time in months, she didn't toss and turn, haunted by nightmares. She just lay on the simple cot, staring up at the dark ceiling of the lodge, and allowed a dangerous thought to take root in her mind. Maybe she hadn't been traded away after all. Maybe after a lifetime of being pushed and pulled and sold and bartered, she had finally landed in a place where she could decide for herself who she was going to be next. This fragile piece, however, was a delicate desert flower, and the storm was coming. The next few days felt like a dream, a strange, hazy dream of a life she could have had. Ellie fed the goats in the morning. She helped Mahuya grind dried roots into a medicinal paste, the rhythmic work of the stone in her hand, a soothing balm to her fractured soul. The sun baked the small camp, and the world felt almost normal. For a few precious hours, she could almost forget the name Riley Creighton, the man who had branded her, the man who had bought her from her uncle. Almost. She was in the middle of the camp, helping a young boy, a quiet, watchful kid named Nampo, tie a splint onto the broken wing of a tiny desert sparrow. She was so focused on the delicate task, on the boy's serious face, that she didn't notice the change at first. But then the camp dogs started barking. It wasn't their usual lazy, half-hearted barking at a passing lizard. This was a sharp, throat-deep alarm, the kind of sound that meant only one thing: trouble. Ellie froze, the piece of sinew still clutched in her fingers. Every muscle in her body went rigid. Her blood ran cold. On the southern trail, a cloud of dust was rising. It wasn't the scattered dust of a desert wind. It was the deliberate, rhythmic plume kicked up by a horse. A single horse moving at a slow, arrogant pace. Not the gait of a traveler in a hurry, but the confident stride of a man who knew exactly where he was going and was sure of the welcome he would receive. And then, through the shimmering heat, she saw him. The same crooked smile that wasn't a smile at all. The same sun-weathered face and cold, dead eyes. The same worn leather boots that had once kicked in the door of a barn she was hiding in. It was Riley Creighton, and he hadn't changed one bit. He swung himself off his horse, casual, as if he were just stopping by for a drink of water. His eyes scanned the silent, watching faces of the camp, and then they locked on to her. A smug, possessive gleam lit them up from within. "I've come to collect what's mine," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the desert silence. No one in the camp moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the dry grass like a warning. Something inside Ellie, something that had been dormant for years, finally broke. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time, it was joined by something else, something hot and powerful. Rage. A solid, bone-deep rage that straightened her spine and lifted her chin. Her legs shook, but not from fear this time. It was the tremor of an earthquake starting deep within her. She took a step forward, and then another. She walked right past Tohan, who had moved to stand in front of her, and faced her tormentor. She looked him square in the eye, the man who had haunted her waking moments and her dreams. "What's yours is rotting back in some Texas saloon, Riley," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm not it." He laughed, a loud, false sound that echoed unnaturally in the wide open space. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, grimy piece of paper. He held it up for all to see. "Got a contract right here," he sneered. "Bill of sale. Says Ellie Mae Bridger belongs to me. Paid a good price for her." The paper didn't matter. The words didn't matter. What mattered was that as he stood there, trying to stake his claim, not a single person in the camp backed away from her. They stood their ground, a silent wall of defiance. Tohan didn't stand in front of her like a shield. He stood next to her, a silent declaration of solidarity. Mahuya stood on her other side, her wrinkled face set like granite. Ellie felt their strength flowing into her. She wasn't just Ellie Mae Bridger, the abandoned girl, the branded property. She was part of this circle. She belonged here. She pointed a trembling finger at Riley's smug face. "I ain't owned," she declared, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. "Not by you, not by my uncle, not by anyone. I am here because I chose to be here." For a long, tense second, the entire desert seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with unspoken violence. Riley's smile finally vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. His hand twitched, moving slowly, deliberately, toward the pistol holstered at his belt. He never made it. Suddenly, a small, dark object flew through the air. It was a stone, thrown with surprising speed and accuracy. It struck Riley's hat, knocking it clean off his head and sending it tumbling into the dust. Everyone turned. It was Nampo, the quiet boy with the broken bird. He stood there, his small chest puffed out, another stone already clutched in his hand, his eyes blazing with a protective fire that mirrored Ellie's own. Someone laughed, a short, sharp bark of a laugh. Maybe it was Ellie. Maybe it was Tohan. Maybe it was all of them at once. The tension shattered. Riley Creighton, The big bad man with his contract and his gun had been disarmed by a child with a rock. Humiliated. He looked from the boy to the silent, unmoving wall of people, and for the first time, Ellie saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. He had come expecting to find a lone, broken girl. He had found a community. He spat on the ground, snatched his hat from the dust, and climbed back onto his horse. He gave Ellie one last long look, and his eyes were filled with a cold, venomous promise. "This ain't over," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You think they can protect you? That mark on your skin, it don't just mean you belong to me. It means you belong to him, and he always gets what's his." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, slower than he had come, a defeated figure swallowed by the vastness of the desert. Ellie stood watching him go, the boy's stone now in her hand. The victory felt sweet, but his final words sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the setting sun. "It means you belong to him." Who was him? She had won the battle, but she had a terrible feeling that Riley Creighton had just declared a war. And it was a war that was coming for all of them. The immediate threat of Riley Creighton was gone, but his parting words hung in the air like a foul smoke. "It means you belong to him." The victory felt hollow, tainted by a new, more sinister mystery. Who was this other man? A man apparently so powerful that even a brute like Riley answered to him. That night, the mood around the fire was different. The earlier relief had been replaced by a quiet, watchful tension. Tohan sat beside Ellie, sharpening the head of an arrow with a piece of flint. His movements were calm, precise, but his jaw was tight. "This man he spoke of," Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you know who he is?" Tohan paused his work. He looked into the fire, his face grim. "There are stories, whispers on the wind, of a man named Silas Kane. They say he runs a network that stretches from Texas to California. He doesn't just deal in cattle or gold. He deals in people." Mahuya, who had been listening from across the fire, spoke up. Her voice was low and heavy. "The brand. When I first saw it, I feared this. It is not a common mark. It is Cain's mark. He believes that what he marks he owns forever, body and soul." A cold dread, far worse than anything Riley had inspired, washed over Ellie. She hadn't just been sold to one cruel man. She had been inducted into a system, a vast and evil enterprise run by a ghost she had never even met. She looked down at her hands, at the orange cloth she still clutched. She had been foolish to think she could just choose a new life. Her past wasn't just a memory, it was a brand, a claim staked by a king in a kingdom of misery. "What does he do with them?" she asked, already afraid of the answer. "Some work as hidden mines," Tohan said, his voice dark. "Some are sold to men even worse than him, and some, they just disappear. Cain is a collector of broken things." The camp fell into a heavy silence. The victory over Riley now seemed like a child's game. They had chased away a dog, but now the wolf was circling. 3 days passed. An uneasy calm settled over the camp. They posted lookouts on the ridges, and the men kept their weapons close. But the sky remained clear, and the horizon empty. A part of Ellie began to hope that Riley's threat had been a bluff, a final act of spite. Then on the evening of the third day, the sky turned a sick, jaundiced yellow. It wasn't the soft glow of a sunset. It wasn't a dust storm. This was different, thicker, hungrier. A smell drifted in on the breeze, a sharp, acrid scent that made the goats restless and the birds fly low to the ground. Smoke. Mahuya was the first to shout. She pointed toward the low ridge to the north, the direction from which the wind was blowing. "The dry grass! Look!" A faint orange glow pulsed against the darkening sky. It was small at first, a flickering candle in the distance. But even as they watched, it grew, spreading sideways like a bloodstain. It was a wildfire, and it was moving fast. Too fast. Panic erupted. People started shouting, grabbing buckets, running to soak blankets in the nearly dry stream bed. But the fire didn't care about their meager efforts. It was a monster devouring the brittle, sun-scorched landscape with a terrifying roar that was now audible, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in their chests. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. Her lungs burned with the thickening smoke. Ash, hot and gray, began to fall like accursed snow. She grabbed Nampo, the boy with the stone, and pulled him toward the relative safety of the camp's center. And then a horrifying realization struck her. Tohan wasn't there. He and two other hunters had gone out that morning, heading north, directly into the path of the fire. Tohan! Someone screamed. Where is Tohan? There was no answer but the growing roar of the inferno. Ellie's training, the hard-won lessons of survival, kicked in. She couldn't freeze. Not now. She shoved Nampo and the other small children toward a dugout cellar behind Mahuya's lodge, a small root cellar that was their only hope of an underground shelter. She covered the entrance with wet hides, the smoke stinging her eyes and choking her breath. The flames were visible now, a wall of churning orange and black cresting the ridge. The heat was immense, a physical blow. The horses screamed and broke free from their tethers, bolting in a blind panic into the night. Tents and lodges at the edge of the camp caught fire, the painted cloths turning to black smoke in an instant. The world had become a living hell. Ellie huddled in the cellar with the terrified children, singing to them. Not a real song, just a low, steady sound to drown out the roar and their own terrified sobs. Nampo clutched her belt, his small body trembling, but his eyes fixed on her face, drawing strength from her calm. Hours passed. The air in the cellar grew hot and stale. The sounds from outside were a terrifying symphony of destruction. And through it all, a single agonizing question burned in Ellie's mind. Where was Tohan? Just when she thought the main fire had passed, a new sound reached them. A splintering crash from directly above. The main support beam of Mahuya's lodge had given way. Dirt and smoking timbers rained down, partially blocking the entrance to the cellar. They were trapped. The air grew thinner, the smoke thicker. The children started to cough, their small bodies struggling for breath. Panic, cold and sharp, began to pierce through Ellie's composure. They had survived the fire, only to be buried alive. Help! She screamed, her voice raw. Is anyone out there? Help us! There was no answer but the crackle of dying embers. She pushed at the fallen beam, her muscles straining, but it was too heavy. Dust and soot filled her lungs. The world started to spin. Nampo's grip on her belt loosened as he slumped against her, his breathing shallow. This was it. After everything she had survived, the betrayal, the branding, the journey, the confrontation, she was going to die in a hole in the ground, suffocated by the ashes of her new home. Just as her vision started to fade to black, she heard a sound, scrabbling, digging, from the other side of the collapsed entrance. Hello? A voice called out, hoarse and strained. Is anyone in there? It was Tohan. A surge of adrenaline shot through Ellie. Tohan, we're here. We're trapped. The digging became more frantic. More voices joined in. Hands, raw and bleeding, clawed at the dirt and debris. After what felt like an eternity, a sliver of night sky appeared. Then an arm reached through. Tohan, covered in soot, his arm wrapped in a blood-soaked rag, pulled her out of the darkness. She stumbled into the devastated landscape of what was once the camp, gulping in the smoky but fresh air. One by one, they pulled the children out. They were all alive. Ellie threw her arms around Tohan, burying her face in his smoke-scented shirt, her body shaking with a relief so profound it felt like pain. He was alive. They were all alive. Later, as they huddled together in the smoldering ruins, Tohan told his story. They had seen the fire coming and had taken refuge in a narrow rock canyon. But as they were waiting for it to pass, they were ambushed. It was Riley Creighton and 3 other men. They hadn't come to fight. They had come to watch. They set the fire, Ellie, Tohan said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. We saw them. They rode along the ridge with torches. They were trying to burn us out, to flush you out like an animal from its den. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was an attack, a calculated act of cruelty. Riley hadn't accepted his defeat. He had gone back to his master, and this was Kane's response. A warning, an act of collective punishment. But Tohan's story wasn't over. There was one more detail, one that turned the blood in Ellie's veins to ice. Before they left, Tohan said, looking at the scorched earth around them, one of them painted something on a rock at the mouth of the canyon, with tar. What was it? Mahuya asked. Tohan met Ellie's eyes, and in their dark depths, she saw a future she had never imagined. It was a date, he said grimly, and a number. 7 days from now. And the number, 20. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was an invoice. Silas Kane wasn't just coming for Ellie. He was coming to collect 20 people. He was coming to harvest the entire camp. The week that followed was a blur of frantic activity and quiet dread. The fire had taken almost everything. Their lodges were gone. Their winter food stores were destroyed. The horses had scattered. All they had left was the water in the stream, a handful of surviving goats, and the clothes on their backs. But the fire hadn't taken their spirit. If anything, it had forged it into something harder, something more resilient. There was no time for mourning. There was only time for survival. They worked together, their movements driven by a silent, shared purpose. The men salvaged what they could from the wreckage, fashioning crude shelters and reinforcing the root cellar. The women, led by Mahuya, scoured the blackened landscape for edible roots and herbs the fire might have missed. Ellie was at the center of it all. The girl who had arrived as a broken piece of cargo was now a leader. She organized the rationing of their meager food supply. She tended to the burned and the injured, her hands now skilled with the pastes and salves Mahuya had taught her to make. She comforted the children, telling them stories of trickster coyotes and brave warriors, her voice a steady anchor in their sea of fear. She and Tohan barely spoke of the coming threat, but it was a constant, unspoken presence between them. At night, they stood watch together, scanning the dark horizon. "We could run," she said one night, the smoke from their small, carefully guarded fire stinging her eyes. "We could scatter. He wouldn't be able to find all of us." "And go where?" Tohan replied, his gaze fixed on the northern trail. "This is our home, the only one we have. And Kane, men like him don't just give up. He would hunt us down one by one. Running is a slow death. Fighting is a chance at life." He was right. She knew he was. They had been erased from the outside world once. They would not allow it to happen again. If they were going to be wiped out, it would be on their own terms, on their own land, fighting for the only thing they had left, each other. A new plan began to form, born not of hope, but of pure, desperate defiance. They couldn't win a straight fight. 20 able-bodied fighters against a camp of mostly women, children, and elders? It was suicide, but they had an advantage Kane and his men didn't. They knew this land, every rock, every ravine, every thorny patch of brush. The desert itself would be their weapon. On the 6th day, their lookouts spotted a lone rider approaching, not from the north where they expected Kane, but from the west. Tension spiked in the camp. Was it a scout? A trap? As the rider drew closer, Ellie recognized him. It was a prospector, an old, grizzled man named Jed, who sometimes traded with the tribe for water and supplies. He was a loner, a man who kept to himself, but he had always been fair. Jed rode into the center of the ruined camp, his eyes wide with shock at the devastation. "Good Lord," he breathed, swinging down from his weary mule. "What happened here?" Tohan explained everything. The brand, Riley Creighton, Silas Kane, the fire, the chilling message left on the rock. Jed listened, his weathered face growing grimmer with every word. When Tohan finished, the old prospector spat on the ground. "Silas Kane," he said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. "I know that devil. He ran me off my claim last year, killed my partner. The man's a plague on this land." He looked around at the determined faces, at the children huddled together, at the makeshift shelters. He saw their desperation, but he also saw their resolve. "He'll have at least 20 men with him," Jed said. "All of them hard cases, killers on his payroll, and they'll all be armed with repeating rifles." The weight of his words settled over them, a crushing blow. Their handful of old hunting rifles and bows and arrows seemed like children's toys against such an arsenal. "But," Jed continued, a glint in his eye, "Kane's got a weakness. He's arrogant. He'll be expecting you to be terrified, to be broken. He'll ride in here like he's the king of the world, expecting you to kneel. Ellie stepped forward. He'll be disappointed. Jed looked at her, a long, appraising look. He saw the scar on her neck, the fire in her eyes. He nodded slowly. I reckon he will be. He turned to his mule and began unstrapping a heavy canvas bundle from its back. I ain't much of a fighter these days, but I passed a few of Kane's outriders on my way here. They're making camp about 5 miles north, getting ready for the big day. He unrolled the bundle on the ground. Inside were 4 shining, new-looking Winchester repeating rifles and several boxes of ammunition. And I also happened to find a stash of blasting powder in an abandoned mine shaft a while back, he said with a sly grin. Never know when something like that might come in handy. A spark of wild, impossible hope ignited in the camp. It wasn't just about weapons. It was about a choice. An outsider, a man who could have just ridden on and saved his own skin, had chosen to stand with them. He had chosen them over the silence. The plan evolved. It became bolder, more dangerous. They would not wait for Kane to come to them. They would bring the fight to him. They would use the terrain, the element of surprise, and Jed's precious blasting powder to turn the tables. The night before Kane was due to arrive was strangely peaceful. A sense of calm had settled over the camp. The fear was still there, but it was now a focused energy, a whetstone against which they sharpened their courage. Ellie sat with Nampo, the boy with the stone. The sparrow he had been mending had healed enough to fly. He opened his hands and the small bird hesitated for a moment before launching itself into the twilight sky. They watched it disappear into the deepening shadows. It's free, Nampo whispered. Ellie put her arm around his small shoulders. Yes, she said. It is. Later, as she stood watch with Tohan on the ridge overlooking the northern trail, he handed her one of the new Winchesters. The metal was cool and solid in her hands. You know how to use this? He asked. My uncle taught me, she said, her voice flat. It's the only useful thing he ever did. She worked the lever action, the sound a sharp, metallic click in the quiet night. She was no longer Ellie Mae Bridger, the traded girl. She was a defender of this small, scarred patch of earth, a protector of this family of outcasts she had chosen as her own. Tohan reached out and gently touched the brand on her neck. His touch sent a shiver through her, but it wasn't a shiver of fear. This does not define you, he said softly. I know, she replied, her voice filled with a certainty that came from the very core of her being. I do. She looked out at the vast, dark desert. Silas Kane was out there, sleeping soundly, confident in his power, dreaming of his new acquisitions. He had no idea what was waiting for him. He thought he was the hunter. He was about to find out he was the prey. The dawn of the 7th day broke red and angry, painting the scarred landscape in hues of blood and fire. There was no fear in the camp now, only a cold, crystalline resolve. Every person had a role. Every action was precise, rehearsed. Jed's blasting powder had been put to terrifyingly good use. Under the cover of darkness, Tohan and the other hunters had planted charges at 2 key points. The first was in a narrow, high-walled canyon a mile north of the camp, the only direct approach. The second was beneath a rocky overhang that overlooked the canyon trail. The plan was simple and deadly. Ellie stood on the ridge above the canyon, the Winchester rifle feeling like a natural extension of her arm. Beside her was Mahuya, armed with an old but reliable hunting rifle, her face a mask of grim determination. Below, hidden among the rocks, were Tohan and the other fighters. The women, children, and Jed were secreted away in the reinforced root cellar, with strict instructions to stay hidden no matter what they heard. They didn't have to wait long. Just after sunrise, a column of riders appeared on the horizon, 20 men just as the invoice had promised. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, their rifles held ready. At their head was a man on a magnificent black horse. He was dressed in a fine black coat, a stark contrast to the dusty, weathered gear of his men. Even from this distance, Ellie could feel his aura of absolute malevolent authority. Silas Kane. And riding beside him, looking smug and triumphant, was Riley Creighton. He pointed toward the canyon, toward the ruined camp. He was leading his master home. They entered the canyon without hesitation. Jed was right. Their arrogance was their greatest weakness. They saw the burned-out camp in the distance and likely assumed its inhabitants were either dead, scattered, or cowering in fear. They rode into the trap as if it were a parade ground. Ellie watched them, her heart pounding a slow, heavy drum beat against her ribs. She waited until the entire column was deep inside the canyon. She raised her rifle, took a steadying breath, and sighted down the barrel. Not at Kane, not at Riley. Her target was a small, prearranged pile of dry brush on the opposite cliff face. She squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon like a crack of thunder. The brush erupted in flame and smoke. The signal. From his hiding place, Tohan lit the fuse to the first charge. A heartbeat later, the world exploded. A section of the canyon wall behind the riders disintegrated in a deafening roar of rock and fire. Boulders the size of horses crashed down, completely blocking the entrance. Kane and his men were sealed in. Panic ripped through the column. Horses reared and screamed. Men shouted in confusion and anger. Before they could regroup, a second explosion rocked the canyon from the front. The overhang collapsed, showering the lead riders with a deadly avalanche of stone and shale, blocking their path of escape. They were trapped, boxed in. Their parade ground had become a kill box. Now! Tohan's voice roared from below. From the rocks on both sides of the canyon, a volley of arrows and bullets rained down on the trapped riders. Men toppled from their saddles, their surprise turning to agony. Kane's disciplined force dissolved into a chaotic mob, firing wildly at enemies they couldn't see. Ellie worked the lever of her rifle, her movements fluid and efficient. Aim, fire, eject, reload. She wasn't thinking. She was pure instinct. She saw a man take aim at Tohan's position and fired. The man crumpled. She saw another trying to scramble up the canyon wall and fired again. It wasn't a battle. It was a harvest. Down below, Riley Creighton's face was a mask of pure terror. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by the frantic desperation of a cornered rat. He saw Ellie on the ridge, and his eyes went wide with disbelief and hatred. He raised his own rifle, a wild shot that whizzed harmlessly past her head. Before he could fire again, an arrow sprouted from his chest. He looked down at it, a comical expression of surprise on his face, then slid from his saddle and lay still in the dust. Tohan lowered his bow. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. When the silence returned, it was deeper, more profound than before. The canyon floor was littered with the bodies of Kane's men, but Kane himself was still alive. His horse had been killed in the second blast, but he had managed to take cover behind a large boulder. He was alone now, his army destroyed, his power shattered. Tohan, Ellie, and the others slowly emerged from their hiding places, their weapons trained on his position. "It's over, Kane!" Tohan shouted. "Come out!" For a long moment, there was nothing. Then Silas Kane stood up. He was unarmed, his fine coat torn and dusty. He looked at the devastation around him, at the faces of the people who had defied him, and he did something utterly unexpected. He smiled. It was a cold, reptilian smile. "Impressive," he said, his voice calm, cultured, and completely out of place in the carnage. "Truly impressive. You are a remarkable commodity, my dear." His eyes fixed on Ellie. "I can see I vastly underestimated the value of my investment." "I am not your investment," Ellie said, her voice shaking slightly, not with fear, but with the sheer force of her hatred. "I am not a commodity." "Oh, but you are," Kane replied smoothly. "Everything is. Everyone has a price. You simply decided to raise yours. Admirable." He took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Very well. You've won the day. I am, as they say, at your mercy." Tohan motioned with his rifle. "On the ground, now." Kane's smile widened. "I don't think so." And then he looked past them, up toward the ridge where Ellie had been stationed. "You can come out now, my friend. The show is over." A figure emerged from the rocks behind where Ellie and Mahuya had been hidden. A figure who should have been in the cellar. A figure holding a pistol. It was Jed, the old prospector. He had the pistol aimed directly at Mahuya's head. "Jed?" Ellie whispered, her blood turning to ice. "What are you doing?" Sorry, kid, Jed said, his face etched with a regret that looked almost genuine. A man's got to look out for himself. Kane pays better. The betrayal was a physical blow, more stunning than any explosion. Jed's help, the rifles, the blasting powder, it had all been a lie, a setup. He had been working for Kane all along. He had helped them build the perfect trap, not for Kane, but for themselves. Kane hadn't been trapped in the canyon. Tohan and the others had been lured down into it. He's right, you see, Kane said, his smile never faltering. Everyone has a price. Jed's was the deed to his old mining claim. What's yours, I wonder? He took another step. Tohan kept his rifle on Kane, but his eyes darted nervously toward Jed and Mahuya. They were in a standoff. Drop your weapons, Jed ordered, his voice raspy. All of you. Drop them, or the old woman dies. Slowly, reluctantly, Tohan and the others lowered their rifles and placed them on the ground. Kane strolled forward, picking up Tohan's rifle. He walked over to Ellie, his eyes gleaming with a possessive fire. You have caused me a great deal of trouble, he said softly, and a great deal of expense. You are going to have to work very, very hard to pay me back. He reached out to touch her face, and in that moment, all of Ellie's rage, all of her pain, all of her defiance coalesced into a single, blinding point of action. She wasn't holding a rifle anymore, but she still had the boy's stone, the one she had carried ever since Riley's first visit. It was in her pocket. Her hand closed around it. As Kane's fingers brushed her cheek, she moved. She drove her knee up into his groin with all her strength. Kane howled, doubling over in agony. At the same instant, Ellie whipped the stone from her pocket and threw it, not at Jed, but at the rock wall just beside his head. The sharp crack of the stone hitting the rock was just the distraction Mahuya needed. The old woman, who had seemed so frail, moved with the speed of a striking snake. She stomped down hard on Jed's instep, and as he yelped and his aim wavered for a fraction of a second, she slammed the butt of her rifle backward into his face. Jed went down in a heap. Tohan didn't waste the opportunity. He launched himself at the stunned guards who had accompanied Jed, a furious whirlwind of motion. Ellie ignored the chaos. Her eyes were only for Kane. He was staggering to his feet, his face contorted with pain and fury, reaching for the pistol at his belt. She was faster. She scooped up the rifle Tohan had dropped and leveled it at Kane's chest. For a long second they stared at each other, the king of misery and the girl he had tried to erase. You're right about one thing, Kane, she said, her voice low and steady. Everyone has a price. Mine is my freedom, and I'm not for sale. She didn't kill him. That would have been too easy an end for a man who had authored so much suffering. She shot the gun from his hand, the bullet tearing through his palm and shattering his wrist. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, clutching his ruined hand. It was over. For real this time. They didn't kill Kane. Justice, Mahuya said, was not the same as vengeance. They tied him and the now unconscious Jed to a mule. Tohan wrote a short, simple note detailing Kane's crimes, the kidnapping, the slavery, the fire, and pinned it to Kane's chest. Then they sent the mule walking west, toward the nearest fort in the justice of the federal marshals. Whether he would ever face a real trial, they didn't know. But they had broken his power. They had destroyed his army, and they had taken back their lives. Weeks passed. The slow work of rebuilding began. With the supplies and weapons taken from Kane's men, life became a little easier. The scar on the land began to heal, with new green shoots pushing up through the blackened earth. The scar on Ellie's neck remained, but when she saw it now, she didn't feel shame. She felt pride. It was a reminder, not of what had been done to her, but of what she had survived. One afternoon, as she was helping to build the frame for a new lodge, a lookout called from the ridge. A visitor was approaching. Not a threat this time, but a small, hesitant figure, walking alone. It was a girl no older than 16. Her hair was a tangled mess, her eyes were wide and empty, and her clothes were stiff with dried blood that was not her own. The camp gathered, watching silently. Ellie put down her tools. She walked to the stream and filled a wooden bowl with water. She took a piece of clean cloth and a simple wooden comb. She walked up to the new girl, who flinched as she approached. Ellie didn't say a word. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask who had hurt her. She simply knelt in front of the girl, dipped the cloth in the water, and began to gently wash the grime and blood from her face. Then she took the comb and with infinite patience began to work through the tangles in her hair. She started to braid, not as a rescuer, not as a savior, but as someone who knew, better than anyone, what it felt like to be erased, and what it took to start writing your own name back into the world. Survival isn't just about breathing when the world is trying to choke you. It's about what you do after. It's about choosing who you become after the fire has passed. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever been burned by something that tried to end you? A betrayal, a loss, a mistake that left a scar so deep you didn't recognize yourself in the mirror anymore? And if you have, what did you do with that scar? Did you hide it away in shame? Or did you turn it into a map, a guide to help someone else find their way out of the dark? If Ellie's story stirred something inside of you, if it reminded you of a strength you forgot you had, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Not just for the next story, but as a promise to yourself. A promise that no matter how many times you get knocked down, you will always get back up. Because in the end, we're all just trying to find our tribe, our place to stand, our moment to say, I am not owned, I am accepted, and I am free.